Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey. So dim the lights, grab whatever questionable herbal tea you convinced yourself tastes good, and let's talk about giant stone heads. Yes, stone heads, on a tiny speck of an island in the Pacific Ocean that was once considered the literal middle of nowhere. I'm talking about Easter Island, or as it's properly called by the people who actually live there, Rapa Nui. It's one of those places everyone has heard of, but almost nobody could find on a map without embarrassing themselves first. It sits about 2,200 miles from Chile, which technically owns it now, but the island itself is about as isolated as you can possibly be while still having Wi-Fi and overpriced Coca-Cola shipped in. And on this island, hundreds of enormous stone statues, the Moai. They're iconic. They look vaguely like solemn men who have seen too much. You've probably seen a meme version wearing sunglasses, but these guys were not made as a joke. They're sacred, symbolic, and extremely confusing to archaeologists. Because here's the thing, they weigh tons, literally. Many are over 30 feet tall. The largest ever completed is almost 70 feet and weighs, well, imagine every time you've overpacked your luggage by 2 kilos. Multiply that by about 200,000. That's the weight we're talking about. And somehow, hundreds of years ago, on a treeless island, without wheels, without cranes, without forklifts, people carved these things, dragged them around, and stood them up like it was just another Sunday. So tonight, let's float lazily through the story of how these statues came to be, and also how the people making them managed to exhaust themselves into near collapse. Because nothing says human history like going way too hard on a building project that ultimately ruins your ecosystem. Now, Easter Island itself is volcanic. It was formed by 3 extinct volcanoes, which is one way of saying Mother Nature was in the mood for a very dramatic landscape. The island is triangular, which feels geometrically pleasing, though nobody actually cares because the only thing anyone comes here to see are the statues. The Rapa Nui people probably arrived around the year 1200, give or take a century, which in historian terms basically means we don't really know, but let's put a number down so it looks respectable. They came by canoe, because of course they did. These were Polynesians, some of the best navigators the world has ever seen. Imagine just hopping into a canoe with a few supplies and going, yeah, we'll find land eventually. Meanwhile, the rest of us can barely follow GPS directions without screaming.
Anyway, they get there. They find a lush island with trees, birds, and plenty of resources, which of course means within a few centuries, all of it will be completely gone, because humans can't resist using things until they break. But before the ecological collapse, there was the golden age of statue making. And the Rapa Nui people had a very specific vision. They decided to carve these giant heads and torsos, which represented their ancestors. The Moai weren't gods. They weren't just creepy lawn ornaments. They were revered forefathers, watching over the community, holding spiritual power called mana. Basically, the bigger your ancestor statue, the more mana your village could claim. Because size matters, apparently, even in the afterlife. So they began quarrying volcanic rock, particularly tuff, which is compressed volcanic ash. It's relatively soft, which makes it easier to carve. Imagine carving a giant block of pumice stone. Still hard work, but not impossible with stone tools. And carve they did. Hundreds of them. The quarry, Ranoraraku, is basically a statue graveyard. Half-finished moai are still lying there, like giant rejected drafts. Some are still attached to the rock face, abandoned mid-project, as if the carvers just went, yeah, you know what? Forget it. Lunch break forever. Now comes the big question. How did they move them? Because it's one thing to carve a giant 40-ton statue out of a volcano. It's another to drag it across several miles of uneven ground and then stand it upright. Early European explorers assumed the islanders must have had some kind of lost technology. You know, the classic ancient aliens theory, which basically says brown people couldn't have done this on their own, so it must have been aliens. Very flattering, totally not racist. But the truth is both boring and more impressive. Recent studies suggest the statues were walked to their destinations. Yes, walked. Picture 3 teams of people with ropes tied around a statue. One team pulls from the left, one from the right, and one from the back to stop it from falling forward. By tugging back and forth, they could rock the statue in a controlled wobble, step by step, like a giant toddler learning to walk. Slow, awkward, terrifying, but it worked. And the kicker? Local oral traditions always said the statues walked. Europeans just didn't take that seriously. Because why listen to the actual descendants when you can come up with conspiracy theories instead?
Of course, all this statue building came at a cost. They needed ropes, sledges, logs, lots of logs, which meant chopping down the island's trees. Over time, the forests disappeared. Birds went extinct, soil eroded, farming collapsed, which led to famine, wars, and, according to some theories, even cannibalism. Nothing brings down the vibe of ancestor worship like eating your neighbor. Though to be fair, recent scholars think the total collapse narrative might be a little exaggerated. Yes, the ecosystem was damaged. Yes, resources ran low. But the Rapa Nui adapted. They invented stone gardens, little rock enclosures that trapped moisture and protected plants from the wind. They didn't all die off in chaos like some 18th century explorer diaries claimed. It's just that Europeans arrived, brought diseases, enslaved a bunch of people, and generally finished the job. Classic colonialism. And let's not forget, the statues themselves changed over time. Early Moai were smaller, rounder. Later, they got bigger, sharper, more stylized. Because once you start competing over giant stone heads, you can't exactly downsize. Nobody wants to be the village with the small ancestor statue. That's embarrassing. Some were capped with red stone hats, called pukao, which makes them look vaguely like they're wearing oversized berets. Others had coral eyes fitted into sockets, which is frankly unsettling. Imagine hundreds of these looming figures staring at you with bulging white eyes. Peaceful bedtime guardians? Maybe. Nightmare fuel? Also maybe. Eventually, many statues were toppled. Some fell during transport, which must have been awkward. Centuries of work, and then faceplant. Others were deliberately pulled down during internal conflicts, so the island became littered with fallen moai. Archaeologists love this because nothing tells a story like hundreds of face-down statues scattered across the landscape. Today, many have been re-erected for tourists, because nothing honors your ancestors quite like putting them back up so cruise ships can get good photos. And that, in a very relaxed nutshell, is the story of the Moai. Giant stone ancestors, carved with devotion, moved with ropes, sweat, and questionable decisions. They stand as symbols of human ambition, spiritual belief, and the occasional ecological disaster. But of course, this is just the beginning of tonight's long, sleepy journey. Because Easter Island may be famous for its heads, but it's far from the only place where people built strange monuments that outlasted their entire civilizations. So, let's float gently over to another corner of history.
So we've set the scene. You're on a volcanic triangle in the middle of the Pacific. You're carving heads out of rocks because you love your ancestors, or maybe because your neighbor has just made a bigger one and you don't want to look like losers. Either way, your life is basically farming sweet potatoes, making ropes, and trying not to get crushed by a 40-ton statue. But let's talk about how these people actually lived. Because history isn't just about the big monuments. It's also about the smaller, more boring details. And boring is what we're aiming for tonight. The Rapa Nui diet was, well, not glamorous. Sweet potatoes were the main staple. Not fries, not chips, just boiled or roasted root. Throw in some bananas, taro, maybe a few chickens. Fish, too, if you could manage to haul one in. But remember, by the time the statue craze had stripped the island of trees, fishing got harder. No wood, no canoes, which made catch of the day less of a thing and more of a wistful dream. And as the forest disappeared, so did the seabirds. Once the island was full of them, thousands nesting everywhere, just waiting to be eaten. But eventually, gone. Humans are great at that. Hey, free birds! 100 years later, where did all the birds go? So, food got tight. People adapted with stone gardens, fields carefully covered with rocks to keep moisture in. Imagine spending your life rearranging pebbles so your sweet potato can grow slightly bigger. Not exactly glamorous royalty life, but it worked. Speaking of royalty, Rapa Nui society was organized around chiefs. Each clan had its leader, its sacred sites, its statues. Power wasn't just about who had the most warriors, it was about who had the tallest Moai, which meant these chiefs were basically locked in a stone measuring contest for centuries. But then came the twist. By the 1500s, people started saying, okay, enough with the statues. We've bankrupted ourselves with ancestor heads. Let's try something else. Enter the Birdman cult. Yes, the Birdman, or in local terms, the Tangata Manu. Every year, competing tribes held a ritual at the cliffs of Orongo. The challenge? Swim through shark-infested waters to a nearby island, grab the first sooty tern egg of the season, and bring it back without dying. The winner's chief got to rule for the year. So, imagine combining Survivor, a triathlon, and Russian roulette. That was the Birdman contest. Whoever came back with the egg was hailed as a champion. His chief was basically crowned king for a year, which is a much cheaper way to show status than carving 30-foot stone ancestors. Plus, nobody had to deforest the island to do it. Practical in its own horrifying way. Now, all this was happening quietly in isolation. Then Europeans arrived, and, spoiler, things went downhill. The first European ship showed up on Easter Sunday, 1722, hence the unimaginative name Easter Island. The Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen got the honor. He wrote about seeing the giant statues, which must have been shocking for people who thought they'd discovered an empty rock. Instead, surprise, it was full of people, chickens, and a few hundred glaring ancestors carved from stone.
The islanders were curious, but cautious. The Europeans, of course, did what Europeans did best. They opened fire at the first sign of confusion. Several islanders were killed for basically standing too close. Classic first contact. Then came the Spanish in 1770, claiming the island for their king, because apparently you can just show up somewhere, plant a flag, and declare it yours. The Rapa Nui chiefs signed some documents in Spanish, which they obviously couldn't read, but hey, paper looks fancy. By 1774, Captain James Cook arrived, doing what he always did, mapping coastlines and writing smug journals. He noticed many statues had already been toppled. Villages were fighting. Resources were thin. The myth of the ecological collapse comes partly from these European accounts, though, let's be honest, Cook wasn't exactly there for long. He spent a few days, judged everything, and left. Not the most reliable Yelp review. But the real disaster came in the 1800s. Slave raids. Peruvians kidnapped hundreds of islanders to work in mines and plantations. Most died. A few made it back, bringing smallpox with them. Then missionaries showed up, as they always did, insisting everyone abandon their old ways. Statues, Birdman cult, ancestral worship all replaced with Catholicism. By the late 19th century, the population of Rapa Nui had plummeted, from thousands of people down to barely over 100. The statues were toppled, villages destroyed, and the culture almost erased. The island became basically a sheep ranch owned by foreign companies, with the Rapa Nui themselves pushed into a small corner. So when you see the Moai today, standing neatly in rows again, remember, that's not how the island looked for centuries. For most of the 1800s and early 1900s, they were face down in the dirt, fallen giants of a broken society. Archaeologists and restorers have since put many back up, which is great for tourism, but it's a curated version of history. And yet, despite all this, the deforestation, the wars, the famines, the colonizers, the Rapa Nui people are still here. They still speak their language. They still tell the stories of their ancestors. They still remember the Birdman races, the mana, the old ways. The statues remain sacred to them, not just tourist backdrops. So when you see the Moai today, standing neatly in rows again, remember, that's not how the island looked for centuries. For most of the 1800s and early 1900s, they were face down in the dirt, fallen giants of a broken society. Archaeologists and restorers have since put many back up, which is great for tourism, but it's a curated version of history. And yet, despite all this, the deforestation, the wars, the famines, the colonizers, the Rapa Nui people are still here. They still speak their language. They still tell the stories of their ancestors. They still remember the Birdman races, the mana, the old ways. The statues remain sacred to them, not just tourist backdrops. So while the Moai are heavy, solemn, and strangely funny-looking, they also carry something heavier: the endurance of a culture that, against all odds, survived. Let's pause here, take a sip of that lukewarm tea you probably forgot about, and drift a little. Because our sleepy history night isn't over yet. We've talked about Easter Island, but there are plenty of other bizarre monuments and questionable royal decisions waiting to be explored. So next, let's float slowly over to Europe, where kings and queens were busy making statues of themselves in the form of, well, actual portraits, and occasionally in the form of children who looked suspiciously like cousins, because that's what happens when you marry too close to the family tree.
So, we're leaving the Pacific now. Goodbye to Moai, volcanoes, and sweet potatoes. Let's drift back across oceans and centuries to the candlelit palaces of Europe. A place where power wasn't measured by stone heads, but by how many cousins you could marry without society batting an eye. Because if there's one thing European royals loved almost as much as gold, it was keeping their bloodlines pure, which, in practice, meant that everyone at court was basically related. A royal family tree didn't branch outward, it just looped back into itself like some very confused pretzel. The results? Well, let's just say the portraits of these monarchs don't exactly scream healthy genetic diversity, and their medical histories read like a hypochondriac's diary. So tonight, we'll meet a few of the most inbred monarchs in history, the ones whose faces, illnesses, and general awkwardness became cautionary tales. Let's start with the poster child of dynastic inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles II was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and when I say the last, I mean it, in every sense. His death in 1700 basically ended the dynasty, and it wasn't just bad luck. His family tree was so tangled it could have doubled as a fishing net. Generations of cousin marriages had compacted his DNA into what scientists today politely call not ideal. His mother and father were uncle and niece, which, if you're wondering, is not great. Charles himself was described by his own contemporaries, mind you, as grotesquely ugly. They called him El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because surely only sorcery could explain his appearance. His jaw jutted so far out he couldn't close his mouth properly. Eating was a challenge. Talking was even harder. He drooled constantly, which isn't exactly the regal presence one hopes for in a monarch. But his looks were only part of it. He was sickly, mentally slow, and sterile, which, when you're a king whose only job is to produce heirs, is a bit of a problem. He married twice. Both wives complained loudly that nothing ever happened. Historians have actually debated whether he even understood what marriage was supposed to involve. Charles II lived 38 long, miserable years, and when he died without an heir, the War of Spanish Succession erupted, dragging Europe into chaos, all because a family couldn't resist the temptation of repeatedly marrying their cousins. But Charles wasn't alone in his miserable genetics. The Habsburg dynasty in general was infamous for its look. The Habsburg jaw, technically mandibular prognathism, became their calling card. You see it in portrait after portrait, a face that looks like someone pressed it into a loaf of bread and then forgot about it. Marriages were arranged to keep territories together. Spain marries Austria. Austria marries back into Spain. Toss in Burgundy, Hungary, Bohemia, maybe an archduchess here and there. Before long, everyone at court was a cousin, an aunt, or sometimes both. Now, let's float north to the British royal family. You might think they'd be different. Spoiler, not really.
Take Queen Victoria. She's often remembered for her strict morals and 9 children, but she also spread a little genetic surprise across Europe. Hemophilia. That's the blood disorder where even a small cut can be dangerous. Victoria carried the gene, and thanks to her extensive matchmaking, it spread to the royal families of Spain, Germany, and especially Russia. Which brings us to Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne. Poor kid couldn't even ride a horse without risking his life. His illness pushed the desperate Tsarina Alexandra into the arms of a certain mystic named Rasputin, and we all know how that ended. Well, maybe not ended so much as spiraled into revolution, civil war, and the execution of an entire dynasty. But details. So yes, one woman's gene helped destabilize half of Europe. Nice work, Victoria. And then, of course, there's Ferdinand I of Austria. He ruled in the mid-1800s. Technically. In practice, he was more of a royal mascot. Born after generations of Habsburg inbreeding, Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and a jaw so misaligned he could barely chew. He was reportedly gentle, simple-minded, and famously obsessed with dumplings. Legend says he once demanded to eat dumplings for every meal and threw tantrums when denied. Honestly, relatable. His reign was mostly ceremonial because he couldn't actually govern. Advisors ran the show while Ferdinand enjoyed his dumplings. And when the revolutions of 1848 rolled around, he was quietly retired and replaced by his nephew, Franz Joseph. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs and Victorians. Inbreeding was the royal sport of the whole continent. The Bourbon dynasty in France, the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria, the Braganzas in Portugal, everyone was marrying cousins, nieces, or whoever happened to be convenient. And while sometimes the results looked fine on the outside, the genetic risks were always lurking. Short lifespans, weak immune systems, infertility, mental instability, you name it. A royal pedigree might look fancy on paper, but in practice, it often produced rulers who could barely rule themselves, let alone entire nations. Now, it's easy to laugh at all this, and we should, gently. But it's also a reminder that dynasties weren't just about politics. They were about control, keeping land, wealth, and titles in the family, literally, even if that meant ignoring the awkward medical consequences. And in the end, all those carefully arranged marriages often led to dynastic collapse anyway. Charles II of Spain died childless. The Romanovs lost their throne in revolution. The Austrian Empire crumbled. The lesson here? Maybe diversify the family tree once in a while. So as we drift further into the night, let's leave the palaces of Europe and their jawline-challenged monarchs. In the next stretch, we'll visit more of history's unfortunate royals. The sad, the sickly, and the spoiled. The children who were born into crowns but carried the weight of their ancestors' mistakes. But we'll save that for our next quiet wander.